By the fire's glow, the truth is always revealed. Welcome to the Fireside Casebook.
The rain in Lochdubh did not fall so much as it hovered, a fine grey saturation that turned the surrounding Sutherland mountains into ghostly silhouettes, and the waters of the sea loch into a sheet of lead. It was the kind of weather that encouraged a man to stay by his peat fire with a pot of coffee and a thick book, which was exactly what Police Constable Hamish Macbeth intended to do. He stood on the bank of the Lochdubh River, his tall, lanky frame shrouded in an old oilskin that had seen better decades. His shock of ginger hair was dampened into flat clumps, and his hazel eyes were fixed with predatory intensity on a swirling pool beneath a moss-covered rock. With a flick of his wrist that owed more to ancestral instinct than police training, Hamish hauled a shimmering silver salmon from the water. "Into the bag with you," he murmured to the fish, before the water bailiff decides to do a day's work for once in his miserable life. Lugs, Hamish's ugly but devoted dog of uncertain breed, gave a sharp, cynical bark. I know it's against the law," Hamish sighed, wiping a smear of river mud from his cheek. "But the law doesn't put protein in the pot, Lugs, and the Strathbane headquarters hasn't seen fit to increase my grocery allowance since the turn of the century." Hamish trudged back toward the village, the weight of the poached fish a comforting presence against his hip. He moved with a deceptive slow-motion gait, a Highland shuffle that tourists mistook for laziness. In reality, Hamish was observing everything. The way Mrs. Wellington's curtains twitched, she was looking for gossip. The fact that the postman's van was parked outside the pub, too early for a pint, so he must be delivering a heavy parcel, and the unusual silence hanging over the old village inn. The inn had recently been purchased by a Mr. Julian Vane, a man who possessed the unfortunate combination of a London accent, a vast inheritance, and the sensitivity of a bulldozer. Vane had spent the last 6 months revitalizing the historic building, which mostly involved painting ancient stone walls a blinding shade of eggshell and firing the local staff in favor of professionals brought up from the south. As Hamish passed the inn's freshly gravelled driveway, a sleek silver Jaguar screeched to a halt, spraying muddy water over Hamish's boots. Julian Vane climbed out, looking like an advertisement for an expensive and entirely impractical country lifestyle. He wore a tweed jacket that had never seen a bramble and boots that had never touched real mud. "You there, Macbeth!" Vane shouted, waving a manicured hand. "I've been ringing the station for an hour. Do you ever actually work, or is the Scottish police force merely a state-funded retirement plan for the lethargic?" Hamish put on his most vacant expression, the one that made Chief Inspector Blair's blood pressure soar. He let his jaw hang open just a fraction. "Terribly sorry, Mr. Vane, I was out patrolling the perimeter. The sheep can be very unruly this time of year." Vane sneered, his lip curling in a way that suggested he smelled something foul, likely the salmon hidden in Hamish's bag. Patrolling the sheep. God help us. Listen, I've had more vandalism. Someone has painted Sassenach Go Home on my new delivery van. In bright blue. I want arrests, Macbeth. I want the full weight of the law. Blue, you say? Hamish scratched his head with agonizing slowness. That would be the colour of the local football team. Or perhaps the sky on the one day a year we see it. It's a very popular colour, blue. Don't be a fool, Vane snapped. It's those ungrateful peasants you call neighbours. I'm bringing jobs to this stagnant puddle of a village, and this is the thanks I get? I'm meeting with my solicitors this afternoon. If you can't find the culprit, I'll ensure your superiors know exactly how you spend your afternoons. Vane slammed the car door and marched toward the inn, his heels clicking arrogantly on the stone steps. Hamish watched him go, his eyes narrowing. The darkness that lived behind Hamish's easygoing façade flickered briefly. He didn't like Vane, but more importantly, he didn't like the way Vane's presence had curdled the air in Lochdubh. A village like this was a delicate ecosystem. If you introduced a predator, the locals tended to bite back in ways that didn't involve blue paint. "He's a marked man, Lugs," Hamish whispered. He turned away, heading for the police station to hide his fish and brew a pot of very strong, very black coffee. He had a feeling he wouldn't get to finish the pot. In Lochdubh, when the air felt this heavy and the Sassenachs grew this loud, the silence that followed was usually broken by the sound of a scream. The smell of frying salmon, seasoned only with a little salt and the illicit thrill of the poacher, was just beginning to fill the small, cramped kitchen of the Lochdubh police station when the peace was shattered. Hamish had just poured his first cup of coffee, black as a peat bog and strong enough to jump-start a rusted tractor, when a frantic pounding began at his front door. Lugs, who had been dreaming of fish guts by the stove, let out a low, mournful howl, sensing that the comfortable afternoon was about to be sacrificed on the altar of duty. Hamish sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of the entire Highlands. He set his mug down on the counter and moved to the door. His tall frame stooped slightly as if trying to minimize his presence in the world. On his doorstep stood Angela, the young woman Julian Vane had hired as his guest relations manager. She was a polished Londoner who usually treated the village with a mixture of pity and terror, but today her composure had evaporated. Her mascara had run in the damp air, giving her the appearance of a startled raccoon. "You've got to come," she gasped, clutching a designer umbrella that was utterly useless against the horizontal Lochdubh rain. "It's Mr. Vane, in the garden. He's quite still, Constable, and he's purple. Purple is a very bold choice for a man of his complexion," Hamish said mildly, though a cold prickle of intuition moved down his spine. He reached for his peaked cap, which sat crookedly on his head, and whistled for Lugs. "Lead the way, miss, and try to breathe. It's the air up here. It's too fresh for some, I find." The walk to the old village inn was short, but by the time they arrived, the rain had intensified into a biting drizzle. Angela led him past the reception hub, which used to be a perfectly good boot room, and out into the back, where Vane had spent thousands of pounds trying to install a Zen meditation garden amidst the stubborn Highland heather. It was a pathetic sight, a few stunted bamboo plants shivering in the wind, a stone lantern that looked like a tombstone, and a shallow ornamental pond filled with stagnant grey water. In the centre of this architectural disaster lay Julian Vane. He was indeed purple. He was also face down in the 4-inch deep pond, which shouldn't have been deep enough to drown a determined squirrel, let alone a grown man. Most humiliatingly, Vane was dressed in a vibrant silk satin kimono embroidered with golden dragons, which he had apparently donned over his expensive woolen long johns. The sight of his pale, hairy legs sticking out from the shimmering silk was a final, cruel joke played by the elements he had tried to colonize. Hamish stood at the edge of the gravel path, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He didn't rush over to the body. He knew a dead man when he saw one, and Julian Vane was currently a permanent resident of the great beyond. Instead, Hamish looked at the way the gravel had been disturbed, or rather the way it hadn't. He looked at the single, ornate rake used for creating ripples in the sand, which was snapped cleanly in half and lying several feet away from the body. "Did you touch him?" Hamish asked, his voice soft, almost lost in the wind. I poked him with my shoe," Angela sobbed. "I thought he was doing one of those mindfulness exercises. He said the village was cluttering his aura, and he needed to centre himself. He's centred now, right enough," Hamish muttered. He knelt down, his knees creaking, and squinted at the back of Vane's neck. There was a faint, bluish bruise at the base of the skull, almost hidden by the silk collar of the kimono. It wasn't the kind of mark left by a fall. It was the kind of mark left by a heavy, blunt object, perhaps something made of Scottish stone or solid oak. Lugs wandered over to the broken rake and sniffed it, then gave a sharp, disapproving sneeze. Hamish followed the dog's gaze. The break in the wood was fresh, but there were no splinters on the ground. Someone had cleaned up, or perhaps the struggle, if there had been one, had been very brief and very efficient. Hamish felt a sudden, sharp pang of annoyance. This wasn't just a death, it was a murder. And a murder meant the big men from Strathbane would be descending upon Lochdubh like a plague of locusts. He could already hear the sirens in his mind, and worse, he could hear the shouting. "Right then," Hamish said, standing up and brushing the wet gravel from his trousers. "Miss, go inside and make yourself a cup of tea. Put plenty of sugar in it for the shock. And don't go letting any of the other staff near the garden. I have to make a phone call." He looked down at the late Mr. Vane, whose golden dragon seemed to be mocking the grey Highland sky. Hamish had wanted a quiet afternoon with a poached salmon. Now he was going to have to deal with Detective Chief Inspector Blair, a man who viewed Hamish Macbeth with the same affection a gardener viewed a particularly stubborn patch of groundsel, as if summoned by the very thought of bureaucratic misery. The distant, discordant wail of a police siren began to drift over the hills from the direction of Strathbane. The news had travelled fast, likely through the postmistress who had seen Angela running for the law. The peace of Lochdubh was officially over, and Hamish's salmon was almost certainly going to burn. The sirens grew from a distant wail into a piercing, rhythmic scream that echoed off the damp crags of Ben Bui, shattering what little remained of the afternoon's tranquillity. 2 white and blue patrol cars from Strathbane, followed by a sombre black van, careened around the corner of the Lochdubh road, their tyres spitting gravel as they swung into the inn's driveway. Out of the lead car exploded Detective Chief Inspector Blair. He was a man who seemed to be composed entirely of high blood pressure and ill-fitting polyester. His face was the colour of a ripe plum, and his small piggish eyes were already darting around in search of someone to blame for the fact that he had been forced to leave his warm office. "Macbeth!" Blair bellowed, his voice cutting through the drizzle like a foghorn. "You great ginger streak of misery! I might have known I'd find you standing around doing nothing while a taxpayer lies dead in a puddle." Hamish stood his ground, his hands still deep in his pockets, his face a mask of mild bovine curiosity. "Good afternoon to you too, sir. It's a grand day for a drive in the country, is it no?" Blair stomped toward the Zen garden, his heavy boots crushing the carefully raked sand that Julian Vane had prized so highly. Behind him trailed Sergeant Macnab, who looked like he would rather be anywhere else, and a team of forensics officers in white suits who looked like lost astronauts in the Highland mist. Blair stopped at the edge of the ornamental pond and stared down at the kimono-clad body of Julian Vane. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Look at this." A London millionaire dressed like a geisha girl, face down in a foot of water. It's an accident, clear as day. He probably tripped over his own skirts while trying to look at his reflection. Case closed. "Macnab, get the photographer and let's get out of this god-forsaken wilderness." "If I might just mention, sir," Hamish said softly, his voice trailing off as if he were unsure of his own thoughts, "there's a bit of a mark on the back of his neck. And the rake over there, it's broken in a very peculiar fashion." Blair turned on him, his neck disappearing into his collar with rage. "Are you trying to tell me how to do my job, Macbeth? You, a village bobby who spends his time poaching salmon and nursing a single pint for 4 hours?" This man was an eccentric. He was old. He was likely drunk on some organic kale juice. He tripped, he hit his head on your peculiar rake, and he drowned. It's a tragedy of stupidity, nothing more. He wasn't much of a drinker, sir, Hamish offered, and the rake didn't have any blood on it. I looked. You looked? You've contaminated a crime scene, Blair screamed, his face now a shade of purple that almost matched the deceased. I should have you suspended. I should have you directing traffic in the middle of the North Sea. Get out of my sight, Macbeth. Go find a cat up a tree or a sheep with a headache. Leave the real police work to the men with the stripes." Blair turned away, dismissing Hamish with a flick of his meaty hand. He began barking orders at the forensics team, telling them not to waste too much time on a clumsy Sassenach. But then Blair's eyes caught sight of the silver Jaguar and the blue Sassenach go-home graffiti on the nearby delivery van. "Wait a minute," Blair muttered, his tone shifting from dismissive to predatory. "Vandalism. Local animosity. Did that paint job, Macbeth? I want a name." Hamish hesitated. He knew exactly who had likely painted the van. Archie MacLean, a man with a fiery temper and a deep-seated hatred for anyone who didn't speak with a Sutherland lilt. Archie had been vocal about Vane's improvements to the village, especially after Vane had tried to block the traditional fishing path that ran past the inn. "It's just a bit of local frustration, sir," Hamish said carefully. "The paint is the same as the clubhouse shutters. It means I have a motive," Blair interrupted, his eyes gleaming. Hatred of the outsider, an escalation from property damage to physical assault. "Where does this Archie MacLean live? I'll bet my pension he's sitting in his cottage right now with blue paint on his fingers and a guilty conscience." "Archie's a fisherman, sir," Hamish pleaded. "He might be a bit loud when he's had a dram, but he's not a murderer. He was likely out on the loch when this happened." "We'll see about that," Blair sneered. "Macnab, get the address. We're going to give Mr. MacLean a taste of Strathbane hospitality. And you, Macbeth, stay here. Guard the gate. Try not to fall asleep and drown in a puddle yourself. It seems to be a trend in this village." Hamish watched as Blair and Macnab climbed back into the car, their tyres throwing more gravel as they sped off toward the cluster of cottages at the far end of Lochdubh. The forensics team began their work with a lack of enthusiasm that suggested they shared their boss's desire to be elsewhere. Hamish sighed and looked down at Luggs, who was sitting by his feet, looking up at him with soulful, knowing eyes. Blair was going to arrest Archie MacLean. He was going to bully the man until he said something foolish, and he was going to ignore the subtle, quiet clues that suggested the killer wasn't a shouting fisherman with a paint can, but someone who moved much more silently through the shadows of the old village inn. "Come on, Luggs," Hamish whispered. "Blair's gone to bark at the wrong tree. Let's go see what the kitchen staff at the inn are whispering about. There's more than one way to catch a salmon, and there's more than one way to find a killer who thinks he's smarter than a lazy village policeman." He turned his back on the official investigation, his mind already beginning to sift through the gossip he had heard over the last week. He needed to talk to someone who saw everything and said nothing. He needed to go to the heart of the village's social network, the kitchen of the hotel. Hamish slipped through the back entrance of the old village inn, his movements as fluid and silent as a shadow crossing the moor. The kitchen was a cavernous stainless steel affair that Vane had installed at great expense, a gleaming cathedral of modern gastronomy that felt entirely out of place in a building with 4-foot-thick stone walls. Despite the clinical shine, the room smelled of damp wool and burnt flour. At the centre of the room stood Mrs. Kennedy, the only local Vane hadn't been able to replace, mostly because the London chef he'd hired had lasted 3 days before fleeing back to civilization, citing aggressive silence from the mountains. Mrs. Kennedy was currently pummeling a mound of dough with a ferocity that suggested she was imagining it was Vane's head. "A terrible business, Mrs. Kennedy," Hamish said softly, leaning against a prep table and making sure Luggs stayed near the door. A man in his prime, taken down by a decorative pond. Mrs. Kennedy didn't look up, but her rhythm slowed slightly. "Prime?" He was a prime nuisance, Macbeth. He had the manners of a goat and the brains of a whelk. "And wipe your feet. You're trailing the whole of the loch across my floor." "I'm that sorry," Hamish apologised, though he made no move to leave. He looked longingly at a cooling rack of scones. I don't suppose a man of the law could find a bit of sustenance? Between the rain and DCI Blair shouting, I'm feeling a bit faint. Mrs. Kennedy huffed, but she plucked a scone from the rack, split it with a thumb, and slathered it in salted butter. She handed it to him on a paper napkin. Blair's a loud-mouthed fool. He's out there now, trying to pin it on Archie McLean just because Archie told Mr. Vane he'd like to see him at the bottom of the sea. Did he now? Hamish chewed slowly, savouring the butter. Archie always did have a way with words. But telling a man you want him dead is a far cry from putting him in a kimono and drowning him in 4 inches of water. It wasn't Archie, Mrs. Kennedy snapped. Archie was at the harbour till 4, fixing his nets with my nephew. No, Vane was looking for trouble elsewhere. He spent the whole morning screaming into that little silver telephone of his, something about a breach of contract and not being intimidated. Hamish leaned in a little, closer, his eyes sharp despite his relaxed posture. He was meeting his solicitors today, he told me. Was there anyone else? Any visitors before the end? Mrs. Kennedy paused, her flowery hands hovering over the dough. She looked toward the swinging doors that led to the dining room, then lowered her voice. There was a car, not the Jaguar, a dark thing, very quiet. It came up the back drive around 2 o'clock. I thought it was a delivery, but no one came into the kitchen. I saw a man walking toward the Zen garden, if you can call that pile of rocks a garden, wearing one of those long, expensive coats they wear in the city. Did you see his face? Only his back, tall, thin, and silver-haired. He looked like money, Macbeth. Not the loud, flashy money Vane had, but the quiet, dangerous kind that's been in the bank since the Jacobites. Hamish nodded, memorizing the detail. And did you hear anything? A struggle? A splash? Just the wind, she sighed, returning to her kneading. And then that Angela girl screaming like a banshee. But I'll tell you something, Macbeth. Before that man arrived, Vane was in a state. He'd fired the new sommelier this morning, and he told me that by the end of the week the inn would have new management, and we'd all be lucky to keep our jobs. He looked like a man who had won a battle but was terrified of the war. Hamish finished his scone and wiped his fingers. The mooching had been productive. Vane hadn't just been an arrogant outsider, he had been a man in over his head, dealing with people who didn't paint Sassenach go home on vans, but instead took care of their problems with a quiet efficiency. New management, Hamish mused. In a village where nothing changes for 100 years, Mr. Vane was trying to move too fast. He patted Mrs. Kennedy on the shoulder. Thank you for the scone, and for the talk. If Blair comes back asking questions, you just tell him I was being a nuisance and you chased me out with a rolling pin. It'll make him happy to think I'm failing at my job. You're always failing at something, Macbeth, she said, though there was a rare glint of affection in her eyes, usually at being as stupid as you look. Hamish stepped back out into the rain, lugs at his heels. He didn't head back to the police station. Instead, he looked toward the high road that led to the Halberton Smythe estate. If there was quiet, dangerous money moving through the Highlands, Priscilla Halberton Smythe would know the scent of it. She moved in those circles, and she had a way of seeing the social rot that Hamish, for all his local knowledge, sometimes missed. As he walked, he noticed the dark tracks of a car on the muddy verge near the back gate, tyres much narrower than a Jaguar's and far more expensive than a fisherman's van. The mystery was deepening, and the darkness beneath the Highland charm was beginning to feel very cold indeed. The wind began to howl in earnest as Hamish climbed the long, winding drive toward Tommel Castle, the ancestral seat of the Halberton Smythes. The grand stone edifice loomed out of the mist like a sullen giant, its windows reflecting the bruised purple of the evening sky. Hamish felt the usual tug of inadequacy that always accompanied a visit here, a mixture of his humble station as a village bobby and his perennial, unrequited pining for the daughter of the house. He found Priscilla Halberton Smythe in the library, a room that smelled of ancient paper, beeswax, and the faint, expensive scent of her perfume. She was standing by a floor-to-ceiling window, a glass of sherry in her hand, looking out at the rain-lashed gardens. She was as beautiful as ever, her blonde hair caught in a casual knot, her expression one of thoughtful melancholy that always made Hamish want to say something profound, and always resulted in him saying something about the weather. "The loch is rising," he said, stepping into the room and feeling acutely aware of his damp oilskin and the muddy prince lugs was leaving on the Persian rug. Priscilla turned, a small, weary smile touching her lips. "Hello, Hamish. I heard the sirens. I take it the Vane Revolution has met a bloody end." "Aye," Hamish sighed, removing his cap and twisting it in his hands. "He's currently cooling his heels, and the rest of him, in his own goldfish pond. Blair is already down there trying to fit Archie McLean for a noose, but Archie's no the type for silken kimonos and silent approaches." Priscilla walked over to a sideboard and poured a second glass of sherry, handing it to Hamish. Julian was a dreadful man, but he wasn't a fool. He was, however, desperately over-leveraged. "My father was at a board meeting in Inverness last week, and the talk was all about the old village inn. Julian hadn't just bought it, he had fronted a deal for a consortium based in London. He was losing control, Hamish. He'd spent the capital on those ridiculous Zen gardens and high-tech kitchens, and the investors were moving in to strip him of his pride and his position." Hamish took a sip of the sherry, the warmth blooming in his chest. Mrs. Kennedy mentioned a visitor. A tall, thin man with silver hair and a car that didn't sound like it belonged on a Highland road. "Does that ring any bells in your circles, Priscilla?" Priscilla's eyes narrowed, her social intuition sharpening. "Silver hair? Tall? That sounds like Arthur Goring. He's a property liquidator." "He doesn't build things, Hamish. He waits for men like Julian to fail so he can pick the carcass clean. He was staying at the manse for a few days. The minister's wife mentioned a distinguished gentleman looking for peace and quiet." "The manse?" Hamish's eyebrows shot up. "The Reverend's wife is a dear soul, but she'd harbour the devil himself if he had a polite tongue and a silver tongue. Why would a London shark stay at a humble manse when the inn was right there?" "Because," Priscilla said, stepping closer, her voice dropping, "Julian had barred Goring from the premises. There was a legal injunction. Julian was fighting to keep the inn, and Goring was here to serve him notice of a hostile takeover. If Julian died before the papers were signed, the ownership would revert to the consortium immediately without the messy court battle Julian was threatening." Hamish let out a long breath. "So, Vane dies, the problem goes away, and the inn becomes the property of a group of faceless men in London. It's a motive as old as the hills, but Julian was found in a kimono." "Hamish," Priscilla pointed out, her brow furrowed. "Arthur Goring is a man of contracts and fine suits. He's not the type to engage in theatrical drowning. It's too messy, too personal." Hamish looked down at his boots, his mind racing. "That's the thing about this village, Priscilla. You can bring your London lawyers and your property deals, but once you step into the Highland rain, things get primitive. Maybe Goring isn't the one who pushed him. Maybe someone else saw an opportunity in the chaos." He looked at her, and for a moment the gap between their worlds seemed to shrink. "You always see the things I miss, Priscilla. You see the money moving under the surface. And you see the people, Hamish," she replied softly. "Just be careful. Blair is looking for a scapegoat, and if you get in the way of a man like Goring, he won't use a blunt object. He'll use the law to crush you." Hamish finished his drink and nodded, the weight of the investigation settling more firmly on his shoulders. He had a motive now, money and power, but he also had a suspicion that the kimono and the pond weren't part of a professional hit. There was a pettiness to it, a local flavour that tasted of old grudges. As he left the castle and stepped back into the biting wind, he knew his next stop had to be the manse. He needed to see this Arthur Goring for himself, and more importantly, he needed to see how the distinguished gentleman reacted to a lazy, ginger-haired policeman who seemed more interested in the price of wool than the details of a murder. The game was afoot, And though the rain was turning to sleet, Hamish Macbeth was starting to feel a familiar cold heat in his blood. The sleet was beginning to turn the road into a treacherous ribbon of black ice as Hamish made his way down from the castle. The wind whistled through the telephone wires, a high, lonely sound that seemed to mock the warmth of the sherry still humming in his veins. He didn't go straight to the manse. Instead, he detoured toward the harbour. If he was going to face a London shark like Goring, he needed his facts as straight as a Highland pine. Down at the pier, the village was in an uproar. The blue lights of Blair's patrol car splashed against the grey stone walls of the cottages. A small crowd had gathered, huddled in their heavy coats, watching as Blair and MacNab dragged a struggling Archie MacLean toward the vehicle. "I didn't do it, you fat Sassenach pig!" Archie roared, his face a vivid scarlet that rivaled Blair's own. "I was on the boat. I was painting the hull. Tell it to the sheriff," Blair yelled back, shoving Archie against the car. "We found the paint, MacLean. Blue paint on your hands, blue paint on your overalls, and a half-empty tin in your shed. You killed him because he blocked your path, and then you tried to hide behind a bit of vandalism." Hamish pushed through the crowd, lugs trotting at his heels. "A bit of a stir for a Tuesday evening, sir," Hamish said, his voice dropping into that slow, irritating drawl. Blair whirled around. "A stir? I've got him, Macbeth. Red-handed, or blue-handed, I should say. He's got no alibi. He says he was alone on his boat from noon till 4. It's an open and shut case." Hamish looked at Archie. The fisherman was indeed covered in blue smears. He looked at Archie's boots, then at the ground. Then he looked past the crowd to where Archie's dog, a moth-eaten collie named Kaiser, was sitting patiently by the edge of the pier, staring out at the water. "It's a grand colour of blue, Archie," Hamish remarked, leaning in to sniff the air around the fisherman. "Very distinctive." "It's Admiralty blue," Archie spat. "For the Highland Star. I bought it from the chandler in Ullapool 3 months ago. Shut up," Blair barked. "Macbeth, get out of the way. We're taking him in." "Just a moment, sir," Hamish said, his eyes sharpening as he noticed something on the sleeve of Archie's jacket. "You say you found the paint in his shed? The same paint that was on the van? Identical," Blair triumphed. "That's strange," Hamish mused, scratching his ear. "Because the paint on Julian Vane's van was still tacky when I saw it an hour ago. Julian told me it was done this morning. But look at Archie's hands, sir. That paint is bone dry. It's flaking. It's been on there since yesterday at the latest. Anti-fouling paint for a boat takes a long time to dry in this damp, but once it's set, it stays set." Blair paused, his mouth hanging open. "So what? He used a different tin for the van." "And there's the matter of Kaiser," Hamish continued, gesturing toward the collie. "Archie and that dog are never apart. If Archie had gone to the inn to settle a score with Mr. Vane, Kaiser would have been right there with him. But Kaiser has a terrible phobia of those ornamental stone lions Vane put at the gate. He won't go within 50 yards of the place. Ask anyone in the village. If Archie had been at the inn, Kaiser would have been howling at the gate loud enough to wake the Covenanters. A dog?" Blair sneered, though his confidence was visibly leaking. "You're basing a defence on a dog's nervous disposition?" "Not just the dog, sir," Hamish said, stepping closer and pointing to the graffiti on the van, which was visible in the distance. "Look at the S in Sassenach on that van. It's painted with a very steady hand, almost like a stencil. Now look at Archie's handwriting on the harbour log." He pointed to a clipboard hanging by the pier. Archie's writing was a chaotic jumble of jagged lines and misspelled words. Archie couldn't paint a straight line if his life depended on it, and he certainly wouldn't spell Sassenach correctly. He usually calls them those English bastards, and leaves it at that. The crowd murmured in agreement. Blair looked from the graffiti to Archie's flaking blue hands, his face contorting with a mixture of rage and realization. He had the wrong man, and worse, Macbeth had pointed it out in front of the whole village. "Fine!" Blair hissed, grabbing Hamish by the lapel and pulling him close. "So it wasn't the fisherman. But if you're so smart, Macbeth, you'd better find me a body that fits. Because if I go back to Strathbane empty-handed, I'm coming back for you." Blair shoved Archie away and stormed back to his car, Macnab following like a shamed cur. As the patrol car lurched away, Archie let out a shaky breath. "I owe you one, Hamish. You owe me a dram, Archie, and you owe that dog a bone." Hamish's face went grim as he looked back toward the village. "The paint on that van wasn't a protest. It was a distraction. Someone wanted us looking at the local hooligans while they took care of Mr. Vane in the garden." He turned away from the harbour, the false lead cleared. The red herring had been neatly gutted, but the real killer was still out there, likely sitting in a warm room at the manse, thinking they had outsmarted everyone. It was time to meet Arthur Goring. The manse was a sturdy, square-built house of dark stone that looked as though it had been designed to withstand the Last Judgment, or at the very least a very long winter. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of floor wax and the faint, sweet aroma of Mrs. MacLeod's legendary sponge cake. Mrs. MacLeod herself, a woman whose kindness was often a tactical cover for an insatiable curiosity, ushered Hamish and a damp lugs into the parlour. "Oh, Hamish, isn't it just dreadful? The poor man, and him so young and full of himself. And now I hear Archie McLean is in handcuffs. Surely not, Hamish." "Archie's back at the harbour, Mrs. MacLeod," Hamish said, accepting a cup of tea with a grateful nod. DCI Blair had a bit of a misunderstanding about the nature of paint and the speed of drying. "Is your guest available, Mr. Goring?" "He's in the study, reading the financial papers. A very quiet gentleman, Hamish. Not a bit like that loud creature at the inn." Hamish thanked her and moved toward the study, his footsteps muffled by the heavy carpet. He found Arthur Goring sitting by the fire, a pair of gold-rimmed spectacles perched on his thin nose. He was exactly as Mrs. Kennedy and Priscilla had described, silver-haired, impeccably tailored even in travel wear, and possessing a gaze as cool and clinical as a surgeon's knife. "Constable Macbeth, I presume," Goring said, not looking up from his paper. "I heard the local constabulary had finally arrived. I trust you found the person responsible for the graffiti? It's a very untidy business." "The graffiti is the least of our worries, Mr. Goring," Hamish said, sinking into a chair opposite the lawyer. "Mr. Vane has had a bit of a terminal accident in his pond, dressed as a dragon, no less." Goring's hands didn't tremble, but he did finally look up. His eyes were a pale, watery blue. "Is that so? How unfortunate." Julian always had a penchant for the dramatic. I suppose the stress finally reached a breaking point. Stress? Or perhaps a visitor? Hamish played with the handle of his teacup. "I understand you were here to serve him notice." "A hostile takeover, I believe the phrase is." Goring gave a thin, dry smile. "I am a liquidator, Macbeth. I deal in the remains of failed ambitions. Julian Vane was a man of great ambition and very little substance. He had borrowed heavily from people who do not enjoy being ignored. My presence here was merely the formal conclusion to a very predictable story." "So you didn't see him today?" "I saw him at 2:00. We had a brief and rather loud conversation in his Zen garden. He was already in that ridiculous kimono, claiming he was transcending his debt. I informed him that the consortium would be taking possession of the inn on Monday. He threatened to expose certain irregularities in the consortium's funding if I didn't give him more time. I told him to speak to my associates in London and left. I have been here since 3, as Mrs. MacLeod can surely testify." Hamish leaned back, his eyes half closed. "Irregularities? Like what?" Goring sighed, a sound like dry leaves skittering on pavement. Julian was a petty man. He believed everyone was as crooked as he was. He claimed he had evidence that the lead investor was using the inn for money laundering. It was nonsense, of course, A desperate man throwing stones at a fortress. Hamish nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about the invisible people again. Goring was too cold, too professional to kill a man with a rake and a pond. It lacked the necessary emotion. But Goring had confirmed one thing. Vane was a cornered rat, and cornered rats tend to bite anyone nearby. He left the manse a few minutes later, the tea warming his belly but the mystery still chilling his bones. He walked back toward the inn, bypassing the main gate where Blair's men were still milling about. He went to the small secluded staff quarters tucked behind the laundry. He found Angela, the guest relations manager, sitting on a bench, staring at the darkened lock. She wasn't crying anymore. In the moonlight, her face looked hard and much older than her 25 years. "Mr. Goring told me about the money laundering, Angela," Hamish said, his voice barely a whisper against the wind. She flinched but didn't look at him. Julian was a liar. He lied about everything. He lied about his wealth, he lied about the jobs, and he lied to me. He lied to you about the money, didn't he? The money you invested with him. Angela turned then, her eyes flashing with a sudden dark fire. It wasn't just my money. It was my mother's life insurance. He told me we were partners. He told me that when the inn was successful, we'd be set for life. Then I found the papers this morning. He'd spent it all, every penny. And when I confronted him, he laughed. He sat there in that stupid dragon robe and told me I was lucky he'd even given me a job. That a little girl from the suburbs should be grateful to be in his presence. The hidden motive wasn't the millions of the consortium or the property rights of the Highlands. It was the petty, crushing weight of a personal betrayal. Julian Vane hadn't been killed by a professional hitman or a territorial fisherman. He'd been killed because he'd laughed at a woman he had ruined, thinking she was too small to strike back. "He called me a clutter in his aura," Angela whispered, her voice trembling. "He told me to go fetch him a green tea and then clear out my desk. He turned his back on me to look at his reflection in the water. He was so proud of himself." Hamish looked at her small, trembling hands. He saw the darkness of the Highlands reflected in her eyes, the same darkness that had swallowed Julian Vane. The mystery was no longer about who, but about how he was going to catch a woman who looked like a victim, but had the cold heart of an avenger. He needed a trap, and he needed it before Blair decided to take his frustration out on the rest of the village. Hamish looked at Angela for a long moment, the wind whipping his ginger hair across his brow. He didn't reach for his handcuffs. He didn't even change his expression from that of a slightly concerned, somewhat dim-witted neighbour. To the world, and certainly to a girl from the London suburbs, he was just a Highland bobby out of his depth. "It's a hard thing being laughed at," Hamish said softly, his voice full of a sympathy that wasn't entirely feigned. "Especially when you've given someone your trust. But you see, Angela, DCI Blair is like a Highland bull in a china shop. He's already tried to gash Archie MacLean, and now that he's failed, he's coming back for a clean sweep of the inn. He's bringing a specialised, forensic team from Glasgow tomorrow morning. They have these new lasers, you see. They can find a single microscopic thread of silk or a teardrop on a stone from 50 paces." Angela's breath hitched, a small, jagged sound in the dark. "Lasers?" "Aye," Hamish lied with the effortless grace of a seasoned poacher. "And they're very interested in that broken rake. You see, the person who used it would have left skin cells on the wood. Even if they wiped it, the deep scan picks it up. But the thing that really has Blair excited is the hidden security. Vane was a paranoid man, wasn't he? He had those little nature cams hidden in the bamboo to record the birds, or perhaps to make sure the staff weren't slacking off in the garden. He saw the colour drain from her face, leaving her looking like a ghost in the Highland mist. The nature cams were entirely fictional. The only things Vane had installed in the garden were expensive rocks and a sense of entitlement. But Angela didn't know that. She only knew the technology of the city, and her own guilt. I imagine, Hamish continued, looking out at the black waters of the loch, that whoever did for Mr. Vane would be very anxious to get that memory card before the Glasgow team arrives at dawn. Blair has the garden cordoned off, but he's gone back to the hotel in Ullapool for a steak dinner. There's only a single constable from Strathbane guarding the front gate, and he's more interested in his phone than the Zen garden. Hamish stood up, stretching his long limbs, and let out a theatrical yawn. Well, I'm off to the station. I have to finish my paperwork, and then I'll be taking Lugs for a long walk over the ridge. I won't be back near the inn until the forensics team arrives at 8. It's a pity, really. If that memory card were to disappear, Blair would have nothing but a purple man in a pond and no way to prove who pushed him. He didn't wait for her to respond. He whistled for Lugs and began to walk away, his boots crunching rhythmically on the gravel. He didn't look back, but he knew the hook was set. In the psychology of the guilty, the fear of what might be found is always more potent than the reality of what is found. Hamish didn't go to the station. He looped around the back of the laundry, moved through the dripping rhododendrons, and took up a position behind a thick stand of pine trees overlooking the Zen garden. Lugs sat beside him, the dog's ears pricked, sensing the tension in his master's body. The minutes stretched into an hour. The sleet turned back into a fine, freezing mist that clung to Hamish's woolen sweater. Then, a shadow detached itself from the staff quarters. It moved with a desperate, jerky speed, stumbling over the uneven ground. Angela appeared at the edge of the ornamental pond, a small flashlight in her hand, its beam dancing frantically over the bamboo and the stone lantern. She began to tear at the foliage, her breath coming in ragged sobs as she searched for the non-existent camera. "It's not there, Angela," Hamish said, stepping out from the trees. He didn't shout, he spoke with the quiet, heavy sadness of a man who had hoped he was wrong. Angela screamed, spinning around, the flashlight falling from her hand and rolling into the shallow water. Its beam illuminated the bottom of the pond, casting long, distorted shadows across the garden. "You lied!" she cried, her voice cracking. "There is no camera." "No," Hamish said, walking toward her, Lugs trotting at his side. "But there is a witness. You see, when I first found the body, I noticed the rake was broken, but I also noticed that your designer umbrella, the one you were holding when you came to my door, had a very specific smear of green algae on the handle, the same algae that grows on the rocks in that pond. You didn't poke him with your shoe, Angela. You held him under with the rake, and when the rake snapped, you used the umbrella to finish the job." He stopped a few feet from her. "You shouldn't have come back for the camera, Angela. But I suppose a person like Vane makes everyone a bit paranoid in the end." For a moment, the only sound was the wind and the distant rhythmic pulse of the sea. Then Angela's face contorted, the mask of the professional manager shattering completely. She didn't look like a killer then. She looked like a broken child. But in her hand, she had picked up the jagged, heavy half of the broken rake. And the look she gave Hamish was no longer one of fear, but of the cold, final desperation of someone who has nothing left to lose. "I have nothing!" Angela screamed, the sound jagged and raw cutting through the rhythmic sigh of the loch. He took it all. He laughed while he did it. He deserved to die in that pathetic little puddle. She lunged then, the broken rake handle whistling through the freezing air. For a man who usually moved with the deliberate slowness of a glacier, Hamish Macbeth reacted with a startling fluid grace. He stepped to the side, the jagged wood missing his shoulder by a fraction of an inch. He didn't reach for his baton. Instead, he held his hands out, palms open, in a gesture that was half entreaty and half command. "Drop it, Angela," he said, his voice dropping an octave, losing its Highland lilt and taking on a hard metallic edge. "It's over. There's no more profit in this." You've already lost your future. Don't go losing your soul over a man as worthless as Julian Vane. But Angela was beyond the reach of reason. The betrayal had curdled something deep inside her, and the fear of the cage was more terrifying than the dark water at her feet. She swung again, a frantic overhead blow. This time, Hamish didn't dodge. He moved in, closing the distance before she could find her momentum. He caught her wrists in a grip of iron, the hands of a man who spent his days hauling salmon nets and splitting peat. They grappled at the edge of the pond, their boots sliding on the treacherous wet gravel. Angela fought with the hysterical strength of the doomed, kicking and biting, her London polish replaced by a primal, desperate violence. "Lugs, stay," Hamish grunted as he twisted her arms behind her back. The dog was circling them, a low, menacing growl vibrating in his chest, his hackles raised like a row of rusty nails. He looked ready to take a piece out of Angela's leg, but he obeyed the command, snapping his teeth in the air to show he was only waiting for the word. The struggle was brief but ugly. They tumbled together into the shallow water, the splash echoing against the stone walls of the inn. The ornamental pond, which Vane had designed for serenity, became a churning mess of grey silt and freezing water. Hamish felt the bite of the ice through his trousers, but he didn't let go. He pinned her against the submerged stone lantern, his weight keeping her down until the fight finally drained out of her. Angela collapsed into a heap of wet wool and sobbing misery. The broken rake handle floated away, bobbing gently toward the golden dragon on Vane's cold shoulder. "There now," Hamish panted, his breath coming in white plumes. He reached into his pocket and produced a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. They ratcheted shut with a final, clinical click that seemed to signal the absolute end of Angela's ambitions. "That's enough of that. You're cold, and you're wet, and so am I. Let's get you inside before the pneumonia does the jury's job for them." He hauled her to her feet, his oilskin dripping and caked in mud. He looked a complete mess. His cap was lost in the pond, his hair was matted with silt, and he had a long bleeding scratch across his cheek where a fingernail had found its mark. He was the very picture of an incompetent village bobby who had tripped into a hole. As he led her toward the back door of the inn, the front gate suddenly swung open. The headlights of Blair's returning car swept across the garden, illuminating the scene like a searchlight. The car screeched to a halt, and Blair tumbled out, his face twisted in a mask of suspicion that quickly turned to bewilderment. "Macbeth!" Blair roared, stomping toward them. "What in the name of God have you been doing? You're covered in filth. And who is this? Why have you got the manager in irons?" Hamish stopped, his face shifting instantly back into its vacant, slightly confused expression. He let his shoulders slump and gave a long, theatrical shiver. "Oh, sir!" "Thank goodness you're back," Hamish said, his voice trembling slightly. "It was the most extraordinary thing. I was just patrolling the perimeter like you told me when I saw this poor girl trying to drown herself in the pond. She was in a terrible state, shouting about cameras and rakes. I tried to stop her, but she became quite hysterical. I had to restrain her for her own safety, you see." Blair looked from the mud-caked Hamish to the shattered, sobbing Angela. His eyes narrowed as he saw the flashlight still shining at the bottom of the pond, illuminating the broken rake handle. Hysterical, was she? Blair stepped closer to Angela, his predatory instincts sniffing out a win. "And why would you want to drown yourself, miss? Unless you had something on your conscience. Something about Mr. Vane." Angela didn't look up. She was broken, the fight entirely gone. "He took everything," she whispered into the rain. "I just wanted him to feel what it was like to have nothing." Blair's face lit up with a triumphant, cruel glow. He turned to Macnab, who was hovering behind him. "Did you hear that? A confession. I knew it. I knew there was more to this than a simple accident. Excellent work, Macnab. We've cracked it." He looked back at Hamish with utter contempt. "As for you, Macbeth, look at the state of you. You look like you've been pulled through a hedge backwards. You're lucky I was here to take over, or you'd probably have let her go and apologized for the inconvenience. Get out of here and get cleaned up. You're a disgrace to the uniform. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir, Hamish said, ducking his head. He whistled for lugs and began to back away into the shadows. I'll just go and put the kettle on. It's been a very taxing evening for a man of my constitution. He turned away, a small, secret smile playing on his lips as he heard Blair began to boast to Macnab about his brilliant interrogation and how he'd seen through the girl's façade from the very beginning. The trap had worked perfectly. The killer was caught, the village was safe, and most importantly, DCI Blair was so convinced of his own genius that the last thing he would want to do was promote the useless peasant who had spent the night rolling in a pond. The rain continued its relentless grey assault on the village, but inside the foyer of the old village inn, the atmosphere was thick with the heat of DCI Blair's self-congratulation. Forensic lights flickered, casting long clinical shadows against the eggshell walls as Blair stood by the mahogany reception desk, looking for all the world like a conquering hero. He had already called his contact at the Strathbane Sentinel, providing a vivid and largely fictional account of how his keen detective's intuition had led him to return to the scene just as the suspect was attempting to flee. Hamish stood in the corner, a puddle of pond water and Highland mud slowly spreading around his boots. He had found his cap, soggy and smelling of stagnant weeds, and had pulled it low over his eyes to hide the sharp, intelligent glint that occasionally betrayed him. Luggs sat at his side, looking equally bedraggled and occasionally shaking himself, sending a fine spray of lock water over Sergeant Macnab's polished shoes. "It's a masterclass in policing, Macnab," Blair barked, ignoring the shivering Angela as she was escorted toward the police van. "I knew the moment I saw that graffiti that we were dealing with a sophisticated diversion. I played along, didn't I? Let the locals think I was chasing shadows, then looped back to catch the real predator in the act. And there she was, trying to destroy the evidence of her own treachery." "Brilliant, sir," Macnab muttered, though he cast a suspicious sidelong glance at Hamish. Macnab had been in the force long enough to know that whenever a case was solved with such convenient timing, the ginger shadow in the corner was usually the architect of the luck. Hamish stepped forward, looking suitably chastened. "I'm that sorry I nearly let her get away, sir," he said, his voice thick with a fake humble burr. "If you hadn't come back when you did, I'd probably be at the bottom of that pond myself. I was just trying to ask her if she'd seen my dog's favourite ball." Blair let out a loud, mocking laugh that rattled the fine china on the nearby display shelf. "Your dog's ball. You see, Macnab, this is why the Highlands are a backwater. We have a cold-blooded murder, a multi-million-pound investment at stake, and our man on the ground is looking for a tennis ball. It's a miracle the sheep aren't running the station." "Indeed, sir," Hamish sighed, looking down at his boots. "I'm clearly no cut out for the fast-paced world of Strathbane. I suppose this arrest will mean a big commendation for you, maybe even a move to the Edinburgh headquarters." The mention of Edinburgh made Blair's chest swell even further. "It's certainly a possibility, Macbeth. A case like this, solved within 24 hours, clear motive, full confession. It looks good on the record. It shows that under my leadership, even the most isolated outposts can be brought to heel. It would be a terrible loss for us here," Hamish said, "but a grand thing for the city. I was worried you'd want me to come along and help with the paperwork, given how I was, present at the time." Blair's face soured at the thought. "You? In a city station? You'd be a liability, Macbeth. You can't even catch a poacher without falling in a river. No, you'll stay here. In fact, I'll make sure the chief constable knows that your involvement was purely incidental. We wouldn't want anyone thinking a village constable had anything to do with a Blair investigation. Would be for the best, sir, Hamish agreed, suppressing a grin. I'd hate for the credit to be misplaced. You found the connection between the money and the motive, after all, and the lasers you were going to bring in. That was a stroke of genius, sir. It really put the fear of God into her. Blair blinked, momentarily confused, as he hadn't mentioned lasers once until Hamish suggested it, but his ego quickly filled the gap. Yes, well, modern techniques, Macbeth. You wouldn't understand. High-tech forensics. It's the only way to catch these London types. As Blair turned away to bark more orders at the forensic team, Hamish felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The credit shift was complete. By tomorrow, the papers would herald DCI Blair as the saviour of Lochdubh, and Hamish Macbeth would be mentioned, if at all, as the local officer who had provided a supporting role before needing to be rescued from a pond. It was exactly where he wanted to be, invisible, underestimated, and most importantly, stationary. He nudged Lugs with his toe. Come on then. Before he decides to give us a lecture on fingerprinting. They slipped out the back door, leaving the noise and the flashing lights behind. The air outside was cold and smelled of wet heather and salt, a far better scent than the clinical eggshell of Vane's doomed hotel. As he walked back toward the police station, Hamish thought of the salmon he'd left in the kitchen. It would be cold by now, and the pan would be a nightmare to scrub, but it was a small price to pay for another year of peace in his beloved Lochdubh. The outsider was gone, the village was quiet, and the only thing Hamish had to worry about now was whether he had enough coffee beans to last through the rest of the week. The red and blue flickers of the police lights finally faded into the mist as the convoy from Strathbane disappeared over the rise of the hill. The silence that followed was absolute, a heavy, damp blanket that settled over Lochdubh with a sense of weary relief. The village had a way of absorbing tragedy, pulling it down into the peat and the dark waters of the loch until it became just another story to be told over a dram in the years to come. Hamish trudged toward his small police station, his boots squelching with every step. He felt the chill of the evening deep in his bones, the kind of cold that no amount of wool could truly keep out. Beside him, Lugs trotted with a slight limp, his coat a matted disaster of mud and pondweed. Both man and dog looked like they had been discarded by the tide, but there was a quiet, satisfied set to Hamish's jaw. Inside the station, the air was still thick with the lingering scent of the salmon he had attempted to fry earlier. He found the fish sitting in the cold pan, a sad grey slab of luxury that had been interrupted by the business of murder. "Well, Lugs," Hamish said, peeling off his sodden oilskin and hanging it by the dead stove. "It's no a gourmet meal any more, but I suppose it'll do for a stew. Waste not, want not, as the minister's wife says when she's offering you a 3-day-old scone." He moved with his usual deceptive languor, busying himself with the ritual of the fire. He cleared out the old ash, layered the peat blocks, and coaxed a small orange flame into life. Slowly, the damp chill of the room began to retreat. He set a pot of water on the heat and began to grind coffee beans, the rich, earthy aroma providing a much-needed antidote to the smell of stagnant pond water. As the coffee bubbled, Hamish sat in his worn armchair, his feet stretched out toward the growing warmth. He thought of Julian Vane, a man who had arrived with such noise and silver-plated arrogance, only to end his days as a splash in a garden that didn't want him. Vane had tried to colonize the Highlands, to turn the wild, unpredictable soul of Lochdubh into something tidy and profitable. He had forgotten that the mountains don't care about investment portfolios, and the people who live in their shadow have very long memories for small slights. There was a light tap at the door. Hamish didn't get up immediately. He knew the rhythm of the knock. It was Priscilla. He opened the door to find her standing there, wrapped in a heavy Barber jacket, her face pale in the moonlight. She looked at his scratched face, his drying hair, and the general state of ruin that was his uniform. "I saw the cars leaving," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Blair looked like he'd just won the lottery. He was shouting into a radio about meticulous police work and undercover operations. Hamish handed her a mug of the fresh coffee. "Aye, he's a grand man for a victory parade, is the DCI. He's convinced he's the one who broke the girl's spirit. He'll be in the papers tomorrow, and I'll be back to chasing stray sheep and checking the fishing permits." Priscilla took a sip of the coffee, her eyes searching his. "You let him take the credit, Hamish. Again. You let him call you a fool in front of the whole village." "It's a small price to pay for the quiet life, Priscilla," Hamish replied, sinking back into his chair. "If I were a hero, they'd want me in Strathbane. They'd want me wearing a tie every day and sitting in an office with a computer that makes noises at me. Here I can hear the wind, I can see the loch. And if I want to catch a salmon for my dinner, there's no one but lugs to tell me I'm breaking the law." Priscilla sighed, a sound that carried a mixture of frustration and affection. "You're a deeply frustrating man, Hamish Macbeth, but I suppose Lochdubh would be a much poorer place without its lazy policemen." She stayed for a while, the two of them sitting in a comfortable, companionable silence as the fire crackled. When she finally left, the village was truly asleep. Hamish finished his coffee and looked at the pot of salmon stew simmering on the stove. He shared a bowl with Lugs, the dog eating with a gusto that suggested he didn't mind the lack of seasoning. As the last of the peat glowed red in the hearth, Hamish climbed the stairs to his small bedroom. Tomorrow the sun would likely stay hidden behind the clouds, the rain would continue to hover over the Sutherland peaks, and the old village inn would sit empty, waiting for the next outsider with a dream and a checkbook. But for tonight, the balance was restored. The stupid policeman of Lochdubh closed his eyes, content in the knowledge that he was exactly where he belonged, among the ghosts, the gossip, and the quiet, enduring shadows of the north.